Our next caller is Stephen from Eugene, Oregon. Stephen, welcome to The Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Thank you for taking my call, Steve. I wanted to ask you a question about Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks, and the statement about the prince who is to come, the people of the prince who is to come. I was reading that recently, and I noticed that, I guess I'd never noticed it before, but it uses the term for Jesus, Messiah and Prince, and then it repeats the term Messiah, and then there's this word Prince again. And I've never heard you or anybody else consider the possibility that the Prince of the people who do the destruction of Jerusalem is Jesus. And I'm thinking in terms of passages in Jeremiah where it talks about Nebuchadnezzar being God's servant, and Cyrus being his servant and his shepherd, and how he uses Assyria like they're my axe head or my axe, and just that, and then the statements in the Olivet Discourse about Jesus, coming, and he's the one bringing this judgment. And it seems to me it would really simplify the whole understanding of that passage if those two words, the Messiah and the Prince, or the Commander, is how I understand it, can also be translated, and then the Messiah, or the Anointed One, and the Commander of the people who's to come, destroy the temple. And it just really simplifies that understanding in terms of that. So anyway, I just wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, well, you're right. You don't hear that view very often, though I have heard it. In fact, people have called with it before. Not very often. Not very often. It's not very common to hear it. There are two major views, and this would be a third view, as to who is the prince who is to come, who destroys the city and the sanctuary in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26. The dispensational view that's the most popular today is that it's talking about some future Antichrist. Right. But there's no reason to really associate with a future Antichrist, because he's talking about the death of Jesus and then the destruction of Jerusalem, which took place in 70 A.D. And he said that the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, you've got a good point in that the destruction of Jerusalem is stated in other passages of the Scripture to be an act of God, an act of God's judgment. In fact, in Matthew 22, and I think it's in verse 7, there's a very close verbal parallel where God is the king who invited the Jews to come to the wedding of his son, and they said no. And it says the king was angry, and he sent his armies and destroyed them and burned up their city. Which is, of course, 70 A.D. Now, to see God as the one who comes and destroys Jerusalem with his armies certainly is not too far a verbal difference from what we have here. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So it's not impossible that Jesus could be the prince, especially as you said, he's called the prince. Earlier in verse 25, he's called the Messiah, the prince. And so that is the basis for some who've called me previously about this, saying that would be Jesus. And I would not rule that out entirely. A more common view, of course, is that the prince who is to come is the Roman armies, the people of the prince who is to come. Now, I will say that I think all things being equal, the Roman general or the Roman prince seems more likely to be the one identified, not because Jesus couldn't be the prince, but because it's not the prince who destroys the city and the sanctuary, it's the people of the prince. And the Roman armies, only by a strange extension of logic, could be called the people of Jesus. Now, of course, they could be the people that he is using. They could be the armies that he is exploiting. And that is true. And no doubt that's what's meant in Matthew 22, when it says the king, who is God, sent his armies, that'd be the Roman armies, and burned up their city. So it is not without precedent that the armies of the Romans could be called God's armies or Jesus' armies that he's using. But in general, we would not think of the Romans, who were certainly the armies that burned up the city, as being Christ's people. And especially when Daniel is told that this prophecy has to do with the fate of Daniel's people, which would be the Jews, seems to be a racial designation there. He said, in verse 24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. And it seems like he's saying your people are the Jews, and therefore the people of this other prince who would come would be the Romans, and the prince would, because he's associated with them, would most likely be the Roman prince. But I would not rule out the possibility that you're suggesting, because by some extension, the Roman armies could be seen and are at least in one place described as God's armies. So you've got a point.
Yeah, the thing you just mentioned about what the Lord said to Daniel, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is that that's sort of interesting that he's not calling them my people, he's calling them your people. And, you know, when Jesus said, you know, your house is left to you desolate, you know, it's like he's making a statement of separation there, you know, in that parable or in that statement to the leadership of Israel. So, but excuse me, I hadn't heard anybody else say that, so I'm glad to hear that there are other people have that idea too. So
you make a viable point.
Thank you.
All right, Stephen. Thanks for your call.